In this section, I'm going to start talking about Ansible 2.5 and 2.4 features. And I first really want to focus on the 2.5 changes in behavior with respect to network CLI. So let's review a little bit about the way that Ansible works in Ansible 2.3 and 2.4. So if we have this simple playbook here, we're calling the iOS command core module. We're using a provider, which is a dictionary that holds our host, our username, our password, potentially some other connection information like the port, the transport, if we're differentiating between SSH and API. So it's generally holding the information we need for our connection, and this is stuffed inside this provider variable. Now, if we look here, I've put the provider just as an inline variable, but typically I would put this somewhere in the inventory system, likely in group vars. If I go ahead and look at my inventory file, we're going to see that this Ansible host, this Ansible user, and this Ansible SSH pass are all getting pulled via inventory. So Ansible user, Ansible SSH pass, and SSH Ansible underscore host. Let's go ahead and execute this playbook. First, let's look at that we're actually using Ansible 2.5.4. Then let's actually see which Python I'm using. That's the right one that I want to be using. Now let's go ahead and execute this. So we'll do Ansible playbook, provider example.yaml, and we'll specify this local Ansible host file. So showarp hopefully should execute successfully. If we did minus VVV on that, we would actually see the showarp in the output. Now, there is a little bit of an issue you run into using provider if you try to pass in a username and a password. So if you try to pass in the username and the password in this format, the password will come across correctly, but in Ansible 2.4, the username actually will not come across correctly. There's a way you can get it using extra vars, but it in general won't come across in a way you expect. So if we look back in my history, here's the format that you could use if I have an example of it. Here's an example of it that I had earlier. You use this extra vars argument to pass in the user, and then you'd use this my underscore user in the playbook. So not all that important point, but there is some issue you get into with passing a username in the way that you'd expect when you're using Ansible 2.4 and 2.3. Okay, so now if we start looking at Ansible 2.5 and how this has changed for the core modules. Let's first look at my inventory. So I've simplified my inventory somewhat in that I only have the Cisco devices and the local device. I still have my Ansible underscore host for both the devices. Now I look at my Cisco vars. Now notice I've specified this Ansible underscore network OS and I've set it to iOS. I've specified this Ansible underscore user, Ansible underscore SSH pass, and I had those two before in my previous inventory with the provider. And I've also specified the Ansible underscore connection equals network underscore CLI. This is what used to be specified as connection equal local. So now we go into here and we look at my new playbook. Now notice there is no provider specified. The provider is inferred from the arguments. You can still use provider, so we could still have provider. It's a little bit ambiguous to me as far as whether Ansible is actually going to deprecate the provider, but if they are going to deprecate it, it's not going to be anytime soon. I don't think it would be before Ansible 2.9. So you can still use provider, but you also have this option of just having Ansible 2.5 infer the connection arguments from what you provide in inventory. So here we specify the module, we specify the commands we're going to execute, and then we would just execute our playbook the same way as we would have before. So, and we specify the inventory file. So this network CLI is the fundamental change in Ansible 2.5. And I would word this change as basically Ansible is trying to pretend that connection equal local doesn't really exist anymore for some of these core modules. It still, in fact, is doing this essential behavior of connection equal local. And what I mean by the essential behavior of connection equal local is the Ansible module is still executing on the control machine. The Ansible module is not being shipped to the remote machine. So it still has this essential behavior of connection equal local, but they're somewhat pretending that it isn't connection equal local. And the reason they're pretending that is they want the networking modules to behave in a more consistent way with their other Linux, their other standard modules. So they're trying to make the networking modules try to behave more consistently with their other, the other modules in the system, a lot of which are intended for system to system Linux, generally Linux behavior. So here we are executing this. Its connection mode is network CLI, so we no longer have the connection local. It is inferring the arguments from what we've defined in inventory, and we're no longer using a provider. Now, one nice side effect of this is if I go and look at my inventory 2 here, you can see that I've commented out the Ansible user and the Ansible password. Those are no longer in inventory. And now I could do these standard arguments that I would expect. So I could say, use the Ansible host. Now I'm going to go ahead and execute it like this and show you that it's going to fail because it doesn't have a username and it doesn't have a password. Now if I go ahead and specify the -u pi class and the -k to prompt me for the password, we can then see that I get the output that I would expect. So these arguments are now working in a way that's consistent with the behavior that I would expect for Ansible modules.